My name is Brooke Edmonds. I'm with OSU Extension, and I'm a community horticulturist in Lynn and Benton County, and I'm helping to organize this webinar series this year. So I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, who's back again. He was with us last year, and so he's back again to talk about powdery mildew. That's Dr. Jay Pscheidt. He received his PhD in plant pathology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1985. And since 1988, he's been a professor at Oregon State University as an extension plant pathology specialist. His principal duties are to lead a statewide extension program related to the diagnosis and management of diseases of all fruit, nut, and ornamental and nursery crops. He's also the co-editor of the regional publication that many master gardeners use, the Pacific Northwest Plant Disease Management Handbook. So Jay has mentioned that he's going to be collecting questions, and then we'll have a session at the end where he'll answer questions. But yes, like Mark said, feel free to put those in the Q&A, and we will get those answered then. So I'll let Jay just take a second here, and he'll share his screen, and then take it away. Thanks.
Screen there. I'm getting thumbs up from Brooke. All right, very good. Here we go with this then. I'll get into powdery mildew biology and management in the garden. I'm an extension plant pathology specialist for Oregon State University. I cover mostly woody perennials, and so that's where most of my examples will be. We'll get into, I have a few mentions of some annuals as well. So we'll focus in on what powdery mildew does, its causes, a little bit of some of the biology, and the latter part we'll get into management, in particular some of those products that people are pushing your way to say that it controls powdery mildew. We'll see how some of those actually work. Yes, I do the plant disease management. I don't do the insect book. I'm getting eclipsed here today. We don't do that one. I just do the plant disease. Yeah, I don't do the weed book either. Get out of here. Okay, we just work on the Plant Disease Management Handbook. I do that in conjunction with my counterpart, Dr. Cindy Oakham, and she handles the small grains and vegetables in there. We're just about ready. The book is almost out for 2018. The website is almost completely updated, and the reason I'm mentioning that is I know that there's a new section on squash varieties that are tolerant to powdery mildew. I checked it this morning about an hour or two ago. It wasn't quite up yet, but it ought to be within the next day or two. So really soon that will be in there for you to take a look at. Lots of color pictures here at the website for folks to take a look at and maybe explore some of the different powdery mildew problems that you might have on the particular crops that you're dealing with. Oh, some of the different programs I have beyond that Plant Disease Management Handbook. We have a program that, for lack of a better term, it's a fungicide testing program. We test a whole lot more than fungicides. We test biological products, extracts, all kinds of different things, even cultural control tactics. Anything that someone says, hey, this controls plant disease, we'll do some testing of it and make sure that it really does. We're sort of the independent third party on that. We have a special farm right across the river from Corvallis that we lovingly call the field laboratory. And this is where we can test these products, find out whether they really work or maybe they're just snake oils, okay? Not working all that well. Funny thing, if snake oil were a real product, it would probably control powdery mildew, and we'll get into that after a bit here. Okay. So powdery mildews, whoa, yeah, they hit a lot of different crops. Fruit crops like cherries and apples and grapes in particular. We'll go through a lot of examples there, but also lots of ornamentals get hit, from lilacs to maples, a lot of different ones that you might be experiencing as well. And then finally, of course, the garden crops, squash, different kinds of squash, sunflowers, peas, all sorts of things can get powdery mildew and be a real problem in the garden. I'll have a few examples here on the annuals, but mostly we're going to concentrate on fruits and ornamentals. Powdery mildews. The first thing I wanted to really get into with powdery mildews is to give you the idea, the concept that there's lots of different kinds of powdery mildews, and although we collect them together in one group, we call them the powdery mildews, they're actually very different fungi. There's a tradition in Europe that they plant roses at the end of grape rows. The reason they do this, well, there's a lot of different reasons for it, and some are very outlandish, but the dominant one that you'll hear, like this Italian grower that I'm showing you here, he'll tell you that the powdery mildew occurs on the roses before it does on the grapes. As soon as they see it on the roses, why, they know to go and start their powdery mildew program on the grapes. What I want to get across to you is that grape powdery mildew does not go to rose, and rose powdery mildew does not go to grape. These fungi are extremely host specific and rarely go to other hosts. So everything that's occurring on one host is just that host. What you might be experiencing is that they are all favored by similar environments. We'll get into that in a moment. There are some exceptions. For example, rose powdery mildew will go to peach, but that's one of the few examples that's out there. If you have a peach or nectarine orchard next to an apple orchard, apple powdery mildew will go to those stone fruits. And you can see these, well, it's not the greatest picture here, but it's called rusty spot on these nectarines here that Jim Travis has this picture here. You don't see active powdery mildew on it, but it is coming from a nearby apple orchard. But those are the few examples that we have. Most of the time, they're very host specific and only attack that one host. The damage that they occur can be quite extensive. So it's not just white powdery things on leaves. You can see here, and I don't know, Brooke, you can tell me whether you're seeing the mouse symbol here. Good, so I can point with that. You can see on the apple here, it has that russeted appearance there. It's kind of pallid. It doesn't have a good eating quality to it. If you saw this apple right next to a healthy apple in the grocery store, why, you wouldn't be buying this apple. So there's a marketing problem with that. On the grapes, you can see they're fully covered with powdery mildew there, but you might think, well, they're fully formed. Maybe we can get some good grape juice out of that. The problem is that the threshold for powdery mildew in grapes, especially in wine, is only 3%. So if that cluster had 100 grapes in it, little grape berries in there, if only 3 of them have powdery mildew on it, you can taste it in the wine, and it does not taste good. It's off flavors and bitter flavors. They're just not good at all, and the vintners cannot blend away from that. So yeah, 3% or less. And the trouble with powdery mildew is it can get going very early. Here is a grape cluster way before it's fully formed. It hasn't even begin to ripen. And here it is even before flowering. Powdery mildew has moved in on top of these grapes. Once in a while you'll see it on other crops as well that early. Here's a picture of the powdery mildew on apple flowers as well. It might be something you're seeing this spring. Grape powdery mildew doesn't just stop there with white powdery plants here. These are my untreated checks. We've done nothing to them. You can see all the white leaves on here relative to the leaves on the vines further down here where we have controlled powdery mildew. And it's a problem in the wine, but it also occurs next year. You can see shock effects from this powdery mildew. Here is a similar block very close to leaf fall, and you can see where my check blocks are. Yep, they're right here. Those, the leaves are going to drop a lot earlier than on those other vines. Also, during the dormant season, guess where my check plots were here? Yeah, it's these darker colored vines right here in the middle. It was controlled on either side of it there. And if you take a look, oh, these are for some apples. You can see the powdery mildew problem on the apples this time of the year as well. You might think, well, the grapes seem to produce a lot. We had a lot of vines there. But if you look real close at it, the ones where powdery mildew was controlled, those vines are thick, they're healthy, they're this lighter color, they're flexible, bendable, and it has a weight to it. If you look at the ones with powdery mildew, they're much darker colored, they're brittle, they break easy. And if you had the exact same amount of vine there, they would be lighter. They just haven't put the storage reserves away for that. And that will affect the grape plant into the next season. So it's not just the one season, especially with our woody perennials. Powdery mildew can affect several seasons down the road. Here's one of our ornamental nurseries where they're growing crab apples. In this crab apple nursery, they want nice, tall nursery stock for you to plant. For places like me, I have deer all over the place in my yard. I have to plant a tree that's 5 foot or taller to keep them out of the way of the deer. Anyway, it would be considered a cull plant if it's these short ones that you see here in the center of the picture. I got a little closer look on that. Yep, it's powdery mildew at the tips, keeping these dwarfed, keeping these short, and that nursery will have to cull those particular plants. So lots of different problems that powdery mildews can cause. And I get into a little bit of biology here, and I want to get across some concepts to you, and I want you to think about baby powder and pepper. Two very strange things, I know, but that kind of describes a lot of what you're going to be seeing on the plants. So most of the time we see that white powdery look to it, as though somebody put baby powder all over the plants. And that's a certain spore type that we'll look at later. Now, if you look closely toward the end of the year, you might see little granular things in this area here. It almost looks like somebody put pepper on there. If you get a magnifying glass out, look a little closer, you'll see little round objects, again, kind of looking like pepper on there. If you get your microscope out and get a lot closer, that baby powder stuff is actually made up of these spores that you see here, long chains of these spores. Versus the pepper part, if you look close at that, well, they're spherical, they're very round, and they have very different powdery mildews have different kinds of appendages on them. They can look very ornate on there. But if you crack them open, you'll see that inside there are little sacs, and in each one of these little sacs are different kinds of spores. These are sexual spores. They've undergone sexual recombination, and ascospore is the big word we use for it. The powdery stuff, the baby powder stuff, those are also spores, but they're different kind. They're asexual spores. This is what gets the sexual spores is what gets the powdery mildew started early in the season for some crops. And the asexual spores, the baby powder stuff, that's what keeps it going through most of the season. Let's look a little closer at some things. Oh, here's a video. Let's hope it works. Of course, it worked in before. Let me just back up a moment and see if we can get that to work again. Back up, and we're going to go forward again and see if we can get that video going.
The fungus mycelium spreads on the plant tissue. Oidium develops rapidly during dry, high-pressure weather conditions, but more slowly during moist weather. After landing on leaves or bunches, the fungus spores germinate and form a germ tube. This attaches itself firmly to the surface and by means of a hostorium removes nutrients from the cells. In periods of high pressure and intensive sunshine, photosynthesis is accelerated and plenty of sugar is produced. Because of increased nutrient supply, the oidium fungus increases its spore production. Chains of spores are formed and the fungus spreads. As soon as 7 new spores have formed a spore chain, they detach themselves and are carried away by the wind. In this way, the powdery mildew spreads explosively in the vineyard. The fungus attacks both the upper and the lower leaf surface. The leaves begin to arch, become brittle, and if the infection is severe, finally die off. When the disease appears early, young bunches and berries are also infected. The bunches may become infected with the greyish-white mesh of the oidium fungus until just before ripening. The fungus destroys the skin of the berries while the inner part continues to expand. The berries burst.
So powdery mildew starts out as just a couple of colonies, very widely scattered. You probably won't even notice them early in the year, but that's when it gets going, and that's when you need to get after this disease. Yeah, those little spores are going to be forming in those colonies. This is on grape, here it is on cherry, and then for going from spore to spore, for something like grape powdery mildew, when everything's going good, we have spore production, liberation, it's deposited on a new healthy leaf, they germinate, they penetrate, produce more spores. This entire cycle can happen as quick as 5 days, just 5 days to go from spore to spore. And then the epidemic is occurring. We have lots of these cycles occurring, many different generations, all season long. Early on, you're not going to see a whole lot, and you're probably going to see it right here in the middle when it's the most difficult to control. And then, of course, later on. So yeah, spore to spore in 5 days. And so by the end of the year, why it looks like it's everywhere. It hasn't magically appeared. It's simply been growing quite a bit all summer long. Later in the year, then, they produce these, what we call Cleistothecia. It's an overwintering structure. That's the peppery-looking things there. And we'll talk about those in just a moment, because that's one way that it overwinters. So a couple of different ways that it overwinters. It gets from one season to the next. So you had powdery mildew last year. You're going to see powdery mildew this year. How does it get from one year to the next? In apple and in grape, we'll show you in grape in just a moment, but in apple, it will infect buds that were produced last year. These buds will come out this spring, and you will see them looking like this, where they're delayed a little bit. Here's another one here on this side of the screen, where they're delayed. They come out and they look all white. It has that white powdery coating on it. It has those asexual spores ready to get the epidemic going right away. Here it is on grape. Again, those buds are usually delayed, and they're deformed when they first start coming out, but they have that white coating on there. And those spores will then go over to the new leaves and get that epidemic underway right away. We see it all the time in apples. We don't see it all the time in grapes. In Western Oregon, we don't tend to see this flag shoot situation unless we have an unmanaged vineyard. This is an abandoned vineyard where we were finding a few flag shoots. Typically, the way it overwinters for grape is with these Cleistothecia. These little peppery things are formed late in the season in the fall, and then rain distributes it to the bark of either trunks, or a lateral trunk here, or a horizontal trunk is called a cordon. It'll be in those areas. And that's the only place we find it in grapes. If it falls to the ground, they're not part of the system and they won't cause any problems. Which is different in cherry. Cherry, it will be on the leaves and the ground and the branches and lots of different places. It won't necessarily just be on the bark that's on there. There are other powdery mildews out there. Most of the time they're on the outside of the plant, which is a good thing, where we can get after them. But there are a few powdery mildews like this one, which are internal to the plant. You won't see a whole lot. They're internal in the leaf, and we'll be able to recognize them when they sporulate, because they'll sporulate right out of a stomata. I just want you to recognize that there are different kinds of powdery mildews, and the ones a little more secretive or hidden than the ones that we typically see and deal with. Now, I've been dealing with mostly pathogen issues here. There's 3 things that it takes to get a plant disease. Takes certainly the pathogen, the powdery mildew that we were talking about. It takes the host, the plant. Of course, we have to have that, but we also have to have a favorable environment to get disease going. So I've been covering pathogen issues. Let's cover host issues a little bit. For grape and apple, the most susceptible period is when we have juvenile tissue. That juvenile tissue is extremely susceptible to powdery mildew. So for grapes, when we get this, during bloom, there's this is basically sepal, but the sepal is fused at the top, and then it forms an abscission layer around the bottom, and so this cap or hood, or the botanical term is calyptra, that pops off, exposing the ovary, which is now going to be susceptible to powdery mildew for the next 4 to 6 weeks. Apple, same sort of thing, where the early stages of growth are most susceptible to powdery mildew infection. With cherries, it's a little bit different. The young juvenile leaves are susceptible, but as we get into the fruit, and this is very more current research, they're finding out, so the leaves are susceptible early on, but the fruit seems to be susceptible later in its development, which is a little bit different. We're still trying to figure out the aspects of cherry powdery mildew and how it gets on the fruit. The other host factor is vigor. Very vigorous growth, like you see on the grapes here on the left side of the screen. That kind of vigorous growth is very favorable for powdery mildew. If it's not as vigorous, it's less favorable for powdery mildew. Things that are good for the host growth will end up being good for powdery mildew growth. It doesn't sound right, but that's the way these diseases are. Powdery mildew, things that are good for the host, good for powdery mildew as well. Here's another, this is an aerial shot of a cherry orchard. You can see it's very strong in these two corners here, but then the trees are a lot smaller and weaker in this corner here and then this corner over here. In this corner we rarely see powdery mildew, but we see it quite a bit in this vigorous area here. That's where we first find the cherry powdery mildew. It's in these vigorous trees, vigorous areas that are growing quite nicely. So those were some of the host factors involved in powdery mildew. How about some environmental factors? What favors powdery mildew? Shade will do that. It doesn't like bright sunlight. So shady areas of your garden are likely to get powdery mildew. Here's a grape vineyard being shaded by some cherry trees nearby. We'll probably see powdery mildew in that particular area much earlier than we would in different parts of the vineyard. Same thing with the susceptible plants in your garden. The other thing that, well, rainfall has two different things going on. The peppery stuff, the sexual spores, the Cleistothecia, they are favored by rainfall. That's what gets them to crack open and release the ascospores. Rainfall will do that. But the powdery part, the asexual spores, they don't like rainfall at all. In fact, they'll take on so much water that they'll burst, sort of like a water balloon. And so they're not favored by rainfall at all. So we tend to have powdery mildews more in more drier weather, especially in western Oregon, as we transition from a really wet spring into a really dry summer. That transition period, very favorable for powdery mildews. That's what gets them going quite a bit. Here's powdery mildew on rhododendron. We have rhododendron leaves out all winter long. It's raining in our particular area, and this powdery mildew survives just fine because it's on the underside of the leaf, and that leaf acts like a little umbrella, sort of protecting that powdery mildew, and the spores are produced there and attack the new leaves as they come out in the springtime. Temperature does drive a lot of our powdery mildew epidemics. Things that you and I think is a nice spring or a nice summer day, powdery mildew likes that weather too. If it's really cold to us, it's cold and not good for powdery mildew development. If it's really hot, like I'll take that back, 95 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, we think that's really hot. That's something that will be detrimental to powdery mildew development. They do have models based on, this is for grapes, model based on powdery mildew development. This is a risk index, goes from 0 to 100. At 60, it's considered a high risk, a lower risk if it's 30 or below. You can see early in our spring and early summer, the risk is very low because the temperatures aren't very favorable, but then very quickly it rises up very quickly above 60 and stays there most of our summer season and makes it very favorable for grape powdery mildew. It starts declining and comes down very close to harvest when things are beginning to get a little cooler. Now there are periods where it does drop below being really high. These periods are usually cool periods or a rainy period that comes through, or in some places, some arid areas like California, potentially Arizona, these periods would be extremely hot times where the risk index would come down like that, but very quickly it jumps back up again. And so here in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, we need to worry about powdery mildew, especially grape powdery mildew, all summer long. So the host issue, young juvenile tissue, very susceptible to the powdery mildew fungus, which can be overwintering as Cleistothecia or as flag shoots, and then temperatures. Mild temperatures favor disease development. Rainfall would be detrimental. It would not be good for powdery mildew development. So that's our disease triangle. That's what's good for powdery mildew development. Let's get on and talk a little bit about control. It's an old advertisement. Some growers simply won't admit their powdery mildew problem is out of control. They're pushing some fungicide somewhere. From Extension, we don't push any particular type of fungicides or any particular method here. I'm going to go through lots of different kinds here for you to kind of look at here. We're going to talk about the principles of plant disease management. Just taking a time check here. There's a number of them, but before I do that, a lot of you are here worried about powdery mildew, but you might have different objectives for control. For example, here's a homeowner who has roses gracing their entryway. These roses, I mean, the the cat's not going to care, right? But here, the homeowner wants these roses to look absolutely perfect. No powdery mildew, no black spot, no rust. They don't want any problems on there at all. They were fretting about a particular leaf here that had some rose mosaic on it, okay? So there are people that are very specific, want to have control to the limit, right? Then we have other homeowners like this one who they don't really care about what they get powdery mildew or black spot or whatever on their roses. They just want rose flowers, okay? I mean, really, take a look at the lawn over here. It's browned out and not really looking all that great. Yeah, they just want the flowers, okay? And you're going to have those kinds of, all the hundreds of people that are online here, you're going to have different objectives with your control program. You might be very specific and want it controlled completely, and others may not care all that much about how much they're finding, as long as they get their objective of a harvest out of there. So the principles of plant disease management, I usually go through 5 different ones, from exclusion, avoidance, eradication, protection, and finally resistance. Now, exclusion I won't get into much. That's more of if we don't have this powdery mildew in the United States, there are quarantines and inspections to keep that out of here. We will talk about an avoidance tactic that we can use. Eradication is kind of hard. Once powdery mildew gets going, it's really hard to catch up to it. There is one product that you can use. We'll get into that in just a moment. I will talk a long time on protection, keeping healthy plants healthy. There's a number of different products that we'll be going over. But actually, I want to start with resistance because it's probably the easiest and most effective tactic that you can use overall. Now, I don't usually show pictures of my own backyard, but I have here. This is my rose garden, and it's what we call the dividing line. So the rose plant here and the ones all going off to the left here, those are my roses, and this rose plant is my wife's rose plant, and all the ones going off that direction. Now, don't get after me here. I've planted the ones over here that are resistant to powdery mildew and black spot and rust. Now, she's planted ones that have colors and fragrances you can't get in resistance, okay? That's generally a lot of what happens. Is we can say plant the resistant type, but that's not what a lot of people want. They want to plant that really susceptible plant, and so that's why we have to have other tactics for powdery mildew management. And I have a little reminder here for those of you who are on here worried about squash powdery mildew, and we can't quite see that squash varieties that are tolerant to powdery mildew table yet. There are some cultivar suggestions for pumpkin, acorn squash, and zucchini. I'll mention the 2 zucchini ones here. One of them is named Payroll, and the other is named Sebring, Sebring. Get onto our plant disease management handbook website, look up squash, and hopefully in the next couple of days that table will be there for you to look those up. So resistance, great tactic, will work quite well. If you're going to plant susceptible types, well, we need some other things that we need to do. Oh, okay, so you buy that resistant plant, and it may be resistant, may still get some disease, maybe not as much as a susceptible type. When you plant it, don't plant it in the shade. Let's get it into a position or a place where it should be planted, where you're not going to encourage powdery mildew development. That's one way to avoid the disease altogether. Now, at this point, I got to talk about water. Water is kind of important because, as I remember, I mentioned that it could blow up those asexual spores. Yeah, if you, as it turns out, irrigating frequently. We have in Western Oregon a lot of container nurseries here. The container nurseries during our summer weather, they need to be irrigated once, twice, sometimes 3 times a day just because of the heat of the summer. They rarely have powdery mildew problems because of this overhead irrigation. Plant spacing will also help. If you space your plants out a little bit better so that there's good airflow between them, again, that's another good way to help avoid conditions that are favorable for powdery mildew. But I want to focus in a little bit on this water aspect. Now, we've run a lot of different trials. I'm going to stay with this slide for just a little bit to explain it. So here's material here. We have just water. We've put it as water in a sprayer as though we were going to spray a fungicide. And we've just sprayed our plants with water. We have grapes, and we have apples, roses, and azaleas. Number of trials. So I did 2 trials for grapes, And I did 2 trials for apples where we just looked at water. For grapes, we had 43% control, just spraying water on it. Not all that great. Apples, 5%, even worse. So that's as opposed to doing absolutely nothing. Apples have, remember, they have that overwintering where we have those flag shoots. If you have flag shoots, it makes it extremely difficult to control powdery mildew, as you can see here. If we get ahead of the game with like grapes, with spraying water, it's better than nothing, but not as good as we might want to have it. Roses, same sort of thing, 25% control, just spraying water. Azaleas, worse, 18%. Now, there's a method of using high pressure water. Again, this is once a week. They've known this for a long time in roses grown in greenhouses. I had a grad student wanted to take just a hose-end sprayer, just a high pressure hose sprayer, hose down the roses very quickly in the middle of the day so it dries off quickly. We were able to get 65% control just using that heavy water spray of powdery mildew. Now, that might not be good enough for some of you rosarians out there, but for others, that might be just the ticket. Want to make sure that you use it in the middle of the day and dry off quicker, because that's something that's going to encourage black spot on roses. I just wanted to show you the data here on a high pressure wash for roses. Okay, we're going to table that for a moment. Oh, hang on, one more thing. So when we want to put a product in there and evaluate the product, it has to do something better than water, otherwise why would we put the product in there? So here you can just put rocks in there. Yeah, it's a product that somebody said was for disease control. It's like granite ground up into a flour. It's just really ground up in a floury consistency. That rock flour, yeah, gave us 69% control on grapes, and it was better than just doing water alone. Now, I wouldn't recommend using rocks out there. It was very hard on the sprayer and the nozzles, so it's not something, but it was something that we were testing. Anyway, water can get you down the road here for powdery mildew control. But before I get into some of the products, you have to get after it in the right way. You have to start your powdery mildew product when? Oh yeah, it was juvenile tissue was susceptible to powdery mildew. So you have to start your spray program fairly early. For apples, we want to get in there pre-pink. That's before bloom. Cherries, about shuck split. There's a papery covering called a shuck, exposing the ovary. Once the ovary is completely exposed, that's a good time to get after cherry powdery mildew. For grapes, about 6 inches shoot growth, well before bloom is when we need to start our fungicide management program. And here it is. These are just some images of powdery mildew on cherry and grape. So for timing, you can't just spray it once. There's no silver bullet to use out there. You have to use these things periodically because the plants are going to outgrow their protection. We usually have to go every 7 to 14 days. That's once a week or once every 2 weeks with a lot of these different products. And coverage is going to be extremely important. You get to have all sides of the plant, top to bottom, and underneath the leaves, because powdery mildew will attack about anything green on those plants. A lot of the fungicides, especially the alternative products, none of these are going to be systemic. There are a few systemic ones. We'll talk about those in just a moment. As far as sprayers that you can get at the garden centers, there's a whole lot of different kinds that you can get. Get yourself a good one and use it for, most of these are air assisted. It pumps up, you pump in air and it will squirt out the product in a high pressure stream that you can use to coat your plants. There's all kinds of products out there, and we'll go through a lot of these things. Some are organic, some are not. We'll let you know about those. Probably the best one that's out there that's been used for many hundreds of years is sulfur. Sulfur is probably the main one, very effective against powdery mildew. There's a lot of commercial types. If you'll notice down here, the Safer Garden fungicide is a homeowner type that you can get for in the home. These are some more current pictures that I took, and you'll notice there's some, all these different products have lots of different ways that you can apply them. This one looks like they actually have a sprayer built into the container itself. This is a Safer Garden fungicide. It's just sulfur. Here's High Yield. It has a dusting or wettable sulfur that you can mix up in those sprayers that we were showing you before. Sulfur is As I said, it was good powdery mildew control. It's relatively inexpensive, and it can be considered organic. Unfortunately, it has a short residual, so this is where you have to go about once a week, especially for like if we're going after grapes right after bloom, every week until you get about 6 to 7 weeks out, and then you can start going every 10 days or so. Good coverage is absolutely essential. Sulfur is not systemic. You have to get on the undersides of the leaves as well as the top side. And we're going to talk about oil next. It's not compatible with oil. I'm going to show you about that in just a moment. In the Willamette Valley, we are blessed with a lot of predator mites, and they will attack and take care of problem mites. Sulfur can disrupt them if you use too much of it. So that's something you want to you need to be aware of. High temperatures, if you apply at 95 degrees Fahrenheit or more, it will cause problems to the plant. It will be phytotoxic to the plant. So you need to spray early in the morning when it's much cooler. And there are some apple cultivars and Concord grapes that don't like sulfur either. It will be phytotoxic no matter what. So it does have its limitations as well as being a good powdery mildew product. Oh, and for you and me, if you do get sulfur on your skin, it can be an irritant. It's not going to kill you. It's not going to cause any problem, but you will be itching and things like that if you get too much on you. Powdery mildew control with sulfur. We have a couple different trials in all these different crops here. And I'm not sure how to remove this window. I'm not even sure if it's showing up or not. Whoops.
Yeah, where is that a Zoom? Is that a Zoom, the participants window or something like that, Jay?
It says, please remove this window away from the shared application. If I knew how, I would do so.
You can't drag it or anything like that?
Oh, I can drag? No, it's not.
Well, I don't know. You may or may not. Okay. Yeah, okay. I would just, I mean, it's not, we can see it sometimes, but it's not terrible. So I think
we're going to ignore it then. We'll look at the data here on sulfur. There are 2 grape trials here, 90% control, 78%. You remember what the water had? Yeah, way better control here with sulfur. Rose, 91% control, and Regalia, 90% control overall there. So yes, sulfur, good material for using against powdery mildew. Oil is the other product that is very good. It also has eradicant activity. These were some pictures I took a while back. Ultrafine sun spray, ultrafine oil was one. Green light rose defense was another. That's a neem oil. There's many others out there. We've used JMS stylet oil a lot commercially. Here's worry-free pesticidal oil that can be used in organic gardening, and you'll notice down here it's canola oil. Here's Rose RX 3-in-1. Well, it's really only got one material in there. It's neem oil. It just is going after soft-bodied insects, mites, and powdery mildew. Don't believe the black spot part of that. It doesn't work on there. Anyway, oil. Oh, one more. I guess we have Dr. Earth's Final Stop Disease Control Fungicide. It has oil in it too. Rosemary oil, clove oil, and peppermint oil in there. The oils work very well, just about any oil from a 1 to 2% solution on products. One good thing about oils is that you can see where you put it. So if you're trying to get good coverage, oils are good for evaluating the kind of coverage you're getting with the particular sprayer that you use because you can see where it's at. For oils, yes, they're good powdery mildew control, and they can also be considered organic depending on their source. Not compatible with oil. I'll show you that in the next picture. They have eradicant activity. Powdery mildew is on the outside of that plant, remember? And the oils on there will denature those spores and what we call sporangiophores, the mycelia, the threads that are producing the spores. It will denature those as well. And so we can cool down an epidemic with oil. And it's about the only thing that you can use to do that. Again, you have to have really good coverage, which means you can't go too early in the morning. If you have dew on, remember, oil and water don't mix. So if you have dew on the leaves, you're not going to get good coverage with your oils. But it can be used as an adjuvant. So you put it in with some of these other materials that we will be talking about and get control with that as well. So I've split these out into petroleum-based oils and botanically based oils. And you can see a lot of different trials, 6 on grape, 2 on apples, 86% control with grapes, not doing quite as well with apples here, 43 and 46% control. With that JMS stylet oil, we're doing even better yet. 5 trials here on grapes, 91% control. And 5 here on grapes with the botanically based oils like neem oil, 69% control. So overall, pretty good powdery mildew control with these oils. I have tended to see, and you'll sort of notice, we tend to get slightly better control with petroleum-based oils than we do with botanical-based oils. The botanical-based oils will probably be the organic ones that you'll be finding out there. This is a picture of what happens when you get oil and sulfur together. What's happened is we've put oil throughout this plant. We sprayed it all with oil, and then we came back through, and unfortunately we had a leaky sprayer, and we had sulfur in the tank, and it was leaking on all the different plants here. And you can see right where those were leaking here, we ended up killing some of these leaves, or at least causing a lot of necrosis on these leaves that you see here. So yeah, oil and sulfur, not good for putting on plants. It's more like an herbicide. Okay, so read the labels carefully, because they will tell you how far apart those products need to be. Now, since we start talking about oils, canola oils and olive oil, all these oils, people start thinking, oh, I can just go to the kitchen cabinet, right? And I can pull all kinds of things out that might control powdery mildews. And so baking soda is a big one that a lot of people were all thought would control powdery mildew very well. And the problem is these do not have labels. So please don't go to the kitchen cabinet, pull things out and spray it all over your plants. There's no use patterns. There's no information on these things for using it against pests in the garden. So even though baking soda would work, it's a sodium bicarbonate. You'll get too much sodium. It's like putting salt on your plants. If you get too much salt on your plants, you'll cause some problems, which is why the industry has gone to potassium bicarbonates. That's what you'll find in the pest control centers is potassium bicarbonate. Here's one called bicarb, old-fashioned fungicide. And yeah, it will control powdery mildew. We've used it a number of different times. Here's the same data on water, same data on rock flour. Here it is bicarbonates, 1 trial on grapes, 5 on apples. You can see it did very well on grapes and does fairly well on apples here. So yes, bicarbonates will work on powdery mildew. Don't use it for black spot on your roses. It simply will not work. Too many people have tried that. It won't work. Oh, I want to back up one more. Sorry about that. On powdery mildews, bicarbonates are a protection material. They will advertise eradicant activity. It doesn't really work that well at all. Once you have powdery mildew, if you put bicarbonate on, you'll have a lot of powdery mildew continued. So use it on a protection basis. It works well. Don't use it on black spot. Whey, yeah, little Miss Muffet sat on her tuffet, eating her curds, and yeah, whey, a byproduct of our dairy industry. We used it a couple of times and got 74% control on grapes. Grape powdery mildew. So yeah, it works. Soaps, yeah, soaps will work. Here's 3 trials. We've used it on a lot of different diseases, a lot of different times. Here's just 3 trials on apples. Wow, 93% control. I think it's one of the better ones we've shown you on apples. Unfortunately, soaps, well, let's take a look at some of the soaps. There's a lot of different kinds of soaps out there. Sometimes they'll call them insect-killing soaps. Yeah, it will also control powdery mildew as well there. You'll notice these are, what does it say there? Potassium salts of fatty acids. Yeah, soap. Copper fungicide. Well, this one's actually a soap that you can use. It actually says that here. Copper soap would probably work on powdery mildew. Not so much. I'm not so sure about these other ones here. The soaps that we've been using commercially, Mpeed is one of them. And this is the reason you don't want to just go get soap out of the kitchen or bathroom and use it, because this is the damage that you can do if you get the rates wrong. Notice the netting and russeting on there. These are apples that have been sprayed with too much Mpeed. And yeah, if you remember what powdery mildew looks like on apples, it looks almost the same, right? So if your control tactic's going to be as bad as the disease, no point in really using it. So yeah, get the commercial materials and follow the label directions. And finally, we have compost teas here. 2 trials on grapes, 1 on apples. Yeah, the not as good as water was even better than using compost teas. Here, yeah, 26%, not all that great, 5% just using the water, a little bit better on apples. I think that's going to be a disappointment to most people. These are botanically based compost teas. Compost teas are very difficult to use and manage and get them out there. The better ones for disease control are actually manure based. I don't know about you, but we're talking about food crops. I don't really want to put manure based teas on my food crops. Not only do we have to worry about plant pathogens, we have to worry about human pathogens at that point. So not really into compost teas that much. And finally, down here, another one here at the bottom, this is a Regalia. This is the only data point I had on it. For cherry powdery mildew, you see we got 55% control, better control with some of these synthetics. In this case, we have 55% control. It's a botanical extract, so I'm kind of moving into some of the botanical or biocontrol products that are out there. Here's one called AQ10. It's a fungus, Ampelomyces quisqualis. It attacks powdery mildew, kind of a fungus that attacks a fungus. So they thought they'd use that. And we tried 3 trials, and we got about as good a control as using water. Oh, if you read the label, though, it says to put a little bit of mineral oil in there, and you'll get good powdery mildew control. And so I asked, well, why did we put the AQ10 in there in the first place? So you might as well just put the oil in there, right? This is why we look at it compared to water. There's another product that hit the home market called Messenger. Now, Messenger it's called it's a harpin protein, and it's, they call it SAR, systemic acquired resistance. They were able to show on annual crops, if you sprayed one leaf, it would send a chemical message to the other part of the plant saying, hey, I'm under attack, please produce products that will control plant pathogens. And that's what this is supposed to do, is stimulate defense mechanisms. And you'll read some of the literature about the salicylic acid pathway and how it does this signaling in the plant. And as soon as people start hearing salicylic acid, they start going to the medicine cabinet, getting aspirin out and start spraying. No, don't do that. For starters, this has no label, and the Messenger, it just didn't really work. I never really had it work very well on perennial plants at all. It might have done something for annuals, but as you've seen, there's a lot better products out there. Serenade's another product that's out there. This is a bacteria. It's a bacillus bacteria, and there's lots of different formulations of it. Here's a commercial dry bag. Here's a home liquid product. Here's another one. This is Bear Defense, I think it is. Natria Disease Control, and it has this Serenade in here. Here it looks like they've produced, it probably hooks up to a hose, like a hose end sprayer. So lots of different ways to utilize these materials. For Serenade, this bacillus bacteria, we tried it 4 times on apples. About 50% control is what we were seeing with this particular product. Seaweeds, we've tried Seaweed, and you can see it didn't really do all that great on apples. I want to make a little aside at this point. When we talk about the seaweeds, and there's a lot of products on the market, well, these are my boys. They're playing with kelp on the Pacific coast. The seaweeds that you're going to get commercially, they're basically Atlantic kelp. The North Atlantic is where they harvest those kelp from, and they make a product of that. We've tried it on other disease problems. I wanted to show you this particular graph here where we have cherry blossom blight control. That's a different kind of a fungus. It's not powdery mildew, but it does tell the story of these alternative products. You notice here in '94, we tried the Seaweed in blue against conventional fungicides. No difference. They did both types of products did very well, controlled this blossom blight very well. In '95 and '96, the seaweeds only gave us about 50% control, where the synthetics gave us quite a bit better control. And then in '97, disease pressure was so high, the seaweeds just didn't work very well at all. The synthetics, however, kept working. And this is quite the story. If you average these out, the seaweeds give you about 50% control of blossom blight. And that's very true for a lot of different alternative products that we've tested over the years. You get about 50% control. The conventional fungicides, they do well no matter the different kinds of years that we have, whether it's a low disease year or a high disease year. They seem to consistently work against diseases. Which is where I'm going to do is I'm going to go into these synthetic chemicals that are available in homeowner products for powdery mildew. One of them is this Immunox for Spectricides Immunox. Here's a liquid formulation here, and then here's one where it actually comes in an aerosol can that your homeowner is spraying it onto her roses there. You can get similar products. Here's Bare Advanced. This is a fungus control for lawns. That one was a granular form. Here's a liquid form. This is Rose and Flower Care. It's a 3 systemic products in one. They actually have a number of different things in here. I believe that's tebuconazole there. So there's a fungicide. Oh wait, I'm over here. Tebuconazole, yes, and imidacloprid, which is an insecticide. You'll notice how they're saying no spraying. So you just mix it up and then pour it onto the plant in a watering can. That's one way to get it on there. It's great for the systemic insecticides. The tebuconazole is a little bit systemic, but I'd rather you sprayed it on. You get a lot better powdery mildew control if you were spraying it on the plant itself. Get the right product and follow the label directions. Here's similar products. Here's fungus control for lawns from Bare Advanced. Here's Fortilome, liquid systemic fungicide 2. This has got propiconazole in it. So they're all from one group. So there's different materials in there, but they have the same mode of activity. So these are all group 3 fungicides. They're called, DMIs, demethylation inhibiting fungicides. Bare Advanced has tebuconazole in there. Fortilome and Infuse have this stuff called propiconazole in there. And the Immunox has this myclobutanyl in there. They are what we call locally systemic in that they move into plant tissue, but they only move with the transpiration stream. So in this case, this is a cucurbit leaf, and we've inoculated the whole thing with powdery mildew. But they've only put the fungicide, a group 3 fungicide, in 4 little spots. There's a little piece of filter paper, and the fungicide has moved from that filter paper into the leaf. It is absorbed into the leaf, and then it's moved to with the transpiration stream out to the edge of the leaf here. So it's what we call locally systemic. Notice it's not moving out of the leaf, okay? So you still have to get good coverage with it, but you may not have to get all sides of the leaf. You don't have to get quite as good a coverage as you would with, say, sulfurs or oil type materials. These are all group 3 materials, lots of different kinds of them, lots of different tests. You'll notice 90s, 80% control, very good control with all these different materials against powdery mildews. And their residual is such that rather than using them once a week like the alternative products, you're using them once every 2 weeks. So a little bit more convenient overall. One of the things with the propiconazole that you might want to, some people consider it a problem, some people don't even notice it a problem. These are hazelnuts. I've treated this one on the left side with propiconazole. On the right side, it's been not treated at all. You notice the propiconazole, the leaves are smaller and they're a darker green color. You'll also get shorter internodes. So if you're a rosarian trying to control powdery mildew and you put propiconazole, too much propiconazole on there, you'll get shorter stems and smaller leaves, which is not what most rosarians are wanting. They want a nice tall rose stem and large normal looking leaves. So do watch out for that. They have a growth regulation activity is what we call that. So there's lots of different groups. There's the sulfurs, the group 3s, and the oils. You can also use bicarbonates and soaps, and biologicals such as Serenade. All of these things will work against powdery mildew. So for powdery mildew management, let's review. We can use resistant cultivars. They have only limited usefulness depending on what type of plant you want to put out there. If your market wants susceptible types, then you might have trouble with that. Sanitation really has very limited usefulness. Even in the backyard, the way these things overwinter, the way they move, it's very difficult to get control with just sanitation alone. You can get at it a little bit, but it's fairly hard for most people. Canopy management is important, pruning for better air circulation. managing fertility, not too much fertility, so you get too vigorous a growth would be encouraging for powdery mildew. And for like grapes, a good training system that has a nice open flow, open canopy will help as well. If you're in arid areas, irrigation management can help as well. Too much can increase humidity to a point where you're encouraging powdery mildews. Drip irrigation is a little bit better than overhead, unless you're using that strong stream once a week that we were showing earlier. Fungicides, good spray technique is absolutely necessary. Good timing, getting it starting early is going to be important to get good powdery mildew control. There's lots of different fungicide groups. Varying them with different modes of action will help control them. If you use just those synthetics, all those group 3 materials, you'll end up getting powdery mildews that are resistant to it, and then you'll have to use the other materials anyway. And limiting the number of applications you use from any particular group. We talk about alternating tank mixing and using combinations, primarily keeping the powdery mildew guessing as to what you're coming at it with next, so it doesn't become resistant. With that, I'm going to end and take questions. Hopefully we can figure out how to get rid of this window here. I'll probably stop sharing, and that will allow that to happen. So there, we're going to stop sharing and go for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Jay. So we do have quite a few questions coming in, and so I'm not sure we'll be able to get to all of them, but we have some time for a few. And I will say to the attendees that your email with the recording link, we're also going to be starting up a Facebook group that will help give you a place to get your questions answered. That was a request to have a place to follow up on things. So let me go back. There's a few questions, Jay, on the biology. So one of the ones was when you were talking about vigorous growth. How is there a way to define vigorous, or is it just in comparison?
Well, I suppose we could use the old analogy of the fruit tree that you could throw a dead cat through or something. I don't know why that one's been out there, but the idea is that it's open. If you're not pruning and you have super vigorous growth where you get several feet of growth on a fruit tree, for example, it's very thick and you can't hardly see through it. That's generally what they mean, and that's vigorous growth. If you back off on the fertilizers, you won't see quite as vigorous growth, and that will help you manage your powdery mildew problem. It really depends on that kind of growth. It's hard if you don't have lots of similar trees to make the comparison with.
A question on the risk index. So Katie wants to know that when the risk index is low, my question just bumped up, is it correct that you can be getting infection if it's wet, but the disease doesn't develop and spread until it's warm and it dries?
So the disease is always active. The risk index was a way of saying, okay, we've started our powdery mildew program. How do we decide how soon to come back and make a reapplication? If the risk index is low, we can extend out our interval quite a bit. If the risk index is high, then we have to keep a short reapplication window. So every 7 days versus every 2 weeks is kind of how we would use that.
Just jumping to more on the management side of things. So we have a lot of our gardeners like Sandra and Skip, they're wanting to know how this data that you have on grapes and apples, perennials, how might that transfer over to some of our annual vegetables? Is there research done on that we can find for them?
I think if you're controlling powdery mildew on roses, apples, grapes, things like that, you'll get control with the similar materials in the annual garden. Direct comparisons, I'm not sure they're out there, but the same sorts of materials are effective in both situations. Again, you need to be kind of early on some of these things, and that might be why some people don't get good control.
And so Sonia was along that same line. She's growing backyard garden produce, and so she's a little bit worried about maybe using some of these specific fungicides. And so I guess just a comment, Sonia, that you would always want to read the label to make sure that you're applying something to an edible crop that's approved. So you know, something for an ornamental may not be able to be used on a edible crop. Can you, okay, so Joanne has a community garden in Bend, and she has a gardener. They do overhead watering, but she uses a mixture of water and milk to control powdery mildew on squash, and she says it works great. But what might make that work? Is this getting at that whey issue, or is this maybe the overhead watering? Any thoughts on that?
I think the overhead watering, unless it's done extremely frequently, it's probably not as beneficial as you think. The spray, the milk spray, probably will have activity, no question. One of the issues we have with milk, though, is with human pathogens. So you would want to wash your produce once you do harvest that, wash that well, so that you don't run into human pathogen problems overall. One more comment. There's no one tactic that's going to work. We want to integrate as many different tactics as we can, and that's what will give you the better powdery mildew control overall.
Right. We have a couple of questions. So Anthony and Kim, they're interested on the treatment effects on pollinators and pollinator health. And I know these are fungicides, and some of our issues in the past have been with some of the insecticides. Are you aware of any studies in the works on pollinator effects?
The effects on pollinators, that's really a hot issue right now, especially from fungicides. They're not what we call acutely toxic. You're not going to spray the flowers, the bee will visit and then keel over dead. They don't work that way at all. We've sprayed lots of fungicides on our farm, and we bring in bees all the time, and no bee kills at all on that. In general, if you're spraying them before the bees are out, that's generally what's recommended if you're spraying during bloom. Or you can delay a little bit till petal fall, times like that where the bees are not going to be visiting quite as much, and that would be more protective. What the active research is doing right now is seeing if the bees get a little fungicide on them, they bring it back, is that affecting some of their food production, which does have a fungal component to that. So there's a lot of active research on that right now to see whether those are problems or not. Right now, I would not worry about them as much. There's more concerns and lack of data than anything else.
Great, thanks. Cheryl is asking about lime sulfur, the combination product, and you've talked about the sulfur having an effect. Do you know about the lime component of that on powdery mildew?
So careful, sulfur is a product, elemental sulfur. Lime sulfur is a completely different product, and it's made differently. The lime that you might use to heighten your pH on your soil, it's not the same lime. It's a spray lime that's mixed with sulfur, and it's boiled, and it's nasty, smelly stuff that I would get the regular product called lime sulfur. It smells like rotten eggs, basically. It's not manufactured in small homeowner products anymore. You can still find it in some garden centers. I literally did that just a couple of weeks ago. If there's a local garden center here in Corvallis that had several bottles of it still left, but I don't believe that they're manufacturing it in small quantities anymore, so it would be difficult to get a hold of it. Works for powdery mildew, no question.
Let's go back to the life cycle and effects of rainfall and irrigation. So Jane, and I think there's another question from Zuan. They are asking just for you to refresh us again on the effects of rainfall on powdery mildew, about the wet conditions and the different spore types. Could you just go through that just one more time really quick?
Yeah, that baby powdery stuff, that's the stuff that's inhibited by rainfall. The spores burst, basically, and the rainfall will wash the spores off, and you can kind of get ahead of things if you come in after a rainfall, although I would prefer to see the applications prior to that. Out west, it may depend on where they're at. Out west here, we have very rainy winters and springs, and then we transition to a very dry, California-like summer. And it's in that transition that we get a lot of powdery mildew started in that arid summer. The powdery mildews just go crazy on that. In back east, if you get into the eastern United States, powdery mildews aren't quite as problematic because of the more frequent rainfall that can occur there during the summertime. That doesn't mean you don't have powdery mildew problems. It just means it's not quite the same pressure that we have here on the West Coast. Does that kind of answer her question? Their question?
Yep, we'll see if she'll comment back in, but I think, yeah. So a couple of these questions are asking for about specific management. So how do you manage on peonies, on squash, on crepe myrtles? And so in my reply back to the group, I can put in some information from the P&W Management Handbook rather than taking some time to go through specific management on that.
Yeah, some of the devil's is in the details and going to those specific crops and powdery mildew on those specific crops. So that's where you'll find what's registered or not if you're looking for materials. And we have cultural control tactics there too.
Right, thank you. Let's see. So maybe just one more since we're running over here a little bit. So Juliana wants to know the mechanism of how the oils work. Is there any study like how they inhibit or discourage the growth of powdery mildew? Is it just a sort of a coating effect, or
it kind of dehydrates them? The mycelia, the threads that make up the powdery mildew will shrink and dehydrate, and the spores are washed off. The kinetophores, where the spores are produced, they also shrink up and don't produce spores once they get hit with that. And that's why you have to have really good coverage. It's not systemic. It's not going to go through the plant to all the different places. But if you hit the powdery mildew well, that's one way to do that. It's better used as a protectant before you see powdery mildew than after you see powdery mildew. That's true for any of these materials that we've been talking about.
Right. So we're almost out of time. Maybe just one more, and this is a question we get quite a bit on the how long these chemicals stay good for, especially the oils. So Cheryl's just wondering on the efficacy of oils or other chemicals. Is there a rule of thumb? Because there's usually not an expiration date on many of these products.
Yeah, that's a good question. If it's certainly if you have a liquid product and it's now solid and you can't get it out, throw it away and get a new one, or you dispose of it properly. Sometimes they don't have expiration dates on them. Had another thought in my mind that just escaped me very quickly on that. Sometimes calling the manufacturer or writing to the manufacturer would be a good way to find that out as well. I'm trying to think if there's if I remember something else off the top of my head. I'm sure I'll remember it when we hang up.
Great, no problem. And we can, if it comes to you, we'll send it out to folks. So everyone, thank you for attending today. Thank you to Jay. We can't all clap, but you'll hear them all coming through. But we really appreciate you talking to master gardeners from Oregon and across the U.S. Be looking out for an email that have an evaluation and some more resources and the recording coming out to you all. And we're setting up our summer schedule. So we have one in May. I'll send out these details as well on dealing with deer and then dealing with food safety in the garden. So Jay was talking about manures in the garden. So we'll have some more webinar series coming up. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time.